Hello, this is Making Sense of History, the podcast where we find out about the present by running the clock back to see where it all started. I'm Nick Eckstein from the History Department at the University of Sydney, talking to you from Wurundjeri land. Welcome to Episode 2 of Making Sense of Anzac, a three-part conversation in which we trace the historical origins of the Australian Anzac tradition. In Episode 1, I discussed the birth of Anzac with Brad Manera, who is Senior Historian and Museum Curator at the Anzac Memorial at Hyde Park in Sydney and an honorary affiliate in the History Department at the University of Sydney. In Episode 1, Brad and I discussed Australia's involvement in Gallipoli in the Dardanelles in World War I in 1915. Brad and I talked about the military disaster at Gallipoli, and we touched on the belief held by many Australians to this very day, namely, that Gallipoli marked the birth of manly qualities that have somehow or other defined what it means to be Australian, or at least what it means to be an Australian male, ever since. If you missed Episode 1, you may like to go back and listen to that first before continuing. Today, in Part 2, we question some of these assumptions. We discover that the meaning of Anzac is neither static nor timeless, as is frequently assumed. We will discover indeed that it has undergone transformations ever since the conclusion of the so-called Great War. And we discuss the role and presence of women, who have played a vital role in Australia's military since well before the Great War, but whose significance has routinely been ignored. Brad, in Episode 1 you explained how Australia's involvement in the war as a whole didn't come overnight or out of nowhere in 1915. And you hinted also that the image of the young Australian male celebrated by Peter Weir in his great film Gallipoli actually goes back to quite a way before Gallipoli as well. Indeed, as you told us, there's talk about resourceful, independent, manly, anti-authoritarian males back in the 1880s. This is a character type that's well established decades prior to World War I. I'm interested in what the Great War added to that persona. Can you tell us?
The great thing that our official historian of the war, Charles Bean's writings have created was a confirmation of those notions that you only had to ask Australia for men who could shoot and ride and they were immediately combat ready. If we're speaking of those idealised characteristics celebrated by Peter Weir, Bean had talked about them as early as 1907. Australian men's anti-authoritarianism, their egalitarianism, their straightforwardness and honesty, it's all there. I guess, Henry Lawson, for example, had said comparable things in the 1890s.
So in one sense, I suppose, Bean's and Lawson's portrayal seems to provide the perfect raw material for fashioning soldiers. But you and I have talked about this as well, and you don't see any transition there at all. In fact, it's a bit of a myth, isn't it? That you can, I think you just said it a moment ago, that you can jump on a horse and suddenly you're a good soldier as well.
That's true. What everyone seems to agree on was that while Australian manhood was great raw material as soldiers, what they lacked was experience and training. Without it, it just adds to the casualty list. The Boer War answered some of the need for battle experience, but it was the Great War that provided the ultimate test. It was at Gallipoli that already existing ideas about Australian manhood underwent their baptism of fire. In an almost literal sense, we can say that the military defeated Gallipoli forged a myth of Australian manhood that in certain ways survives even now.
We've been talking about how manly qualities often thought to have been forged in the Great War were actually being celebrated in Australia in the late 19th century. What happened when older values associated with Australian manhood over many decades needed to be adapted for a military frame of reference? Is there any sense in which either the people who recruited Australians or the people who volunteered themselves might have overestimated their capacity to be successful in war? As a nation, did Australia suffer from overconfidence?
Those that went to Gallipoli absolutely believed that they were bigger and stronger than everybody else. They were descendants of the British Empire, but they were sort of just that little bit stronger, a little bit tougher, and they performed extremely well at Gallipoli. They earned an international reputation there. but it was also a very rude awakening. They realised that they were not professionals, that they did need to go back to the drawing board. They did need to learn the profession of arms. And having left 8,700 dead on the peninsula of their mates, it was a brutal introduction.
Brad, at the end of our conversation in episode 1, I referred to the silence surrounding the involvement of women in the Australian military. And at the top of today's episode, I said that we needed to address it. That silence is extraordinarily unjust, because while the version of the Anzac tradition that has held sway for over a century barely mentions women, they've been there all along, haven't they?
Many people indeed might suggest that the Anzac legend is purely the domain of male military personnel, and as we've been saying, their role in this tradition is to be irreverent, brave in combat and loyal to their mates. Need to accept that it does not follow from this that Australian women were simply stoic and passively supportive. We shouldn't need proof of this, but it's just a fact that there are many examples of Australian women in wartime who manifested extraordinary intellectual and emotional endurance, who were at least the equal of the men who were carrying weapons.
And I think one of your own forebears is an example, is that right?
In my own family, there have always been photographs of strong, independent, intelligent women. My great-grandmother raised and led a troop of Rough Riders called the Wild Australia Troop that represented the newly federated nation at the Festival of Empire, celebrating the coronation of King George V in 1911, for example.
So that's a very early example. But there is an active female role being played even earlier than that, I think.
Australian women went to the Boer War as nurses. You know, we're talking about a culture that really is very, very male oriented, and, you know, women needed to be protected. But clearly those women didn't like being as protected and as cloistered as they were. They couldn't wait to get away to the war. There was a huge demand amongst the nursing population, for example, when the Medical Corps looked at sending contingents to South Africa. At least as many as 60 Australian nurses went to South Africa, and it is suggested that up to 200 served with imperial units and played a very active role, although they were denied frontline service.
The enthusiasm of these women to be involved wasn't always welcomed, was it?
Of course, there have been changes. I mean, even at the time of the Boer War, Australian women were looking to educate themselves, and by the time of the Great War, there were qualified Australian women doctors who asked the AIF for roles within our military nursing and military hospital service, casualty clearing stations and so on. The response was to immediately knock them back. So they looked elsewhere. Indeed, a number of Australian female doctors from Sydney University served in the British forces and found themselves operating as surgeons and trauma doctors very close to the front. Australian women turned up in some of the most unlikely places during the Great War, from driving ambulance for the Scottish Women's Hospital on the Salonika and Serbian fronts is one of my favourites. Their number included Miles Franklin, the author.
That involvement that you're describing continues uninterruptedly, doesn't it?
Yes, it's been growing. As women are taking a much more active role outside the domestic sphere, so indeed are women appearing much more frequently and in higher profile roles in Australia at war. During the Second World War, Australian women were heavily involved in our war industries, as well as serving in auxiliary units in the Navy, the Army and the Air Force. Some of our great heroes of the Second World War include amazing people. The remarkable heroism of Sister Vivian Bullwinkle, who earned a Royal Red Cross. She was the only survivor of the massacre of Australian nurses on Banker Island in 1942. The George Medal, one of the highest awards for non-combatant bravery, was awarded to Matron Ellen Savage, who was the only nurse to survive the sinking of the hospital ship Centaur by a Japanese submarine in 1943. And she was instrumental in keeping other survivors alive and maintaining their spirits despite the pain of her own wounds. It's evolved even further. I mean, today women command rifle companies in infantry battalions. They fly fighter jets. They even serve aboard submarines. The Australian Defence Force includes female rear admirals, a lieutenant general, and at least 2 air vice marshals.
Among the principal ritual observances by which Anzac Day is marked every year on the 25th of April, the public marches that take place in cities and towns across the nation loom very large.
The Anzac Day marches have certainly evolved over the years, and the composition of the marches has changed. They were initially very male-dominated because the reality of Australia's role in the Great War was that we sent our young men to fight. As women have played a larger and more prominent role in Australia's war efforts, they've been correspondingly more represented in the Anzac Day March. From a tiny contingent of former AIF nurses in the marches after the Great War through the 20s and 30s to much larger post-Second World War contingents of former members of women's auxiliaries from the Australian Defence Forces, today the Anzac Day marches include fully integrated contingents of current serving personnel, as well as the veterans of the exclusively women's units that existed through the 1950s, 60s and 70s.
And in those Anzac Day marches, would you say that women express a collective identity of their own within the larger identity of the military as a whole?
Look, I think you can say that. I mean, clearly esprit de corps is a issue with every unit that marches on Anzac Day, and some of the women's contingents go out of their way to make sure they are marching in step or have coordinated their dress to represent the colours they once served in. I noticed in the last Sydney Anzac Day march, the former nurses were wearing grey and red, a very clear historical reference to the colours of the uniforms worn by Australian nurses dating from the 19th century.
One of the essential features of any cultural tradition is that its principal characteristics are often discussed as if they're timeless. So in public discourse, Anzac is usually discussed in almost essential terms. And by that I mean that the idea of an Anzac spirit is often treated as if it's a timeless and quintessentially Australian essence, something that's eternally true, something that doesn't change. Is that an accurate summary?
It's true in one sense, but it's difficult to make generalisations, and it's also important to note that at the same time, the significance of Gallipoli and the Anzac tradition are influenced by changing events and by historical circumstances.
Are these clear enough that you could talk about identifiable phases in the history of the tradition?
No one thing is going on at any one time. Ideas and attitudes overlap, but things certainly change. And the way in which the Gallipoli campaign is memorialised and remembered has evolved. For example, the 25th of April 1916, a year after the original landing, there was this huge spontaneous outburst of emotion around the world. Wherever there were Australians, they wanted to do something to mark that year. And that was the origins of the Anzac Day March. It was the origins of recognition that something special had happened on that day, something significant. You know, by the 1920s, the Anzac Day March had become formalised and the day had become a national statement of remembrance.
There's the fact also that Australia experienced not just one but 2 world wars and therefore 2 generations of veterans. What effect does that have on the significance and prominence of the Anzac tradition?
Yeah, I think that Second World War coming so quickly on the heels of the First cemented a lot of practices. Australia had fundamentally very similar attitudes in 1914 and again in 1939. However, experience of the massive impact of the Great War had reduced the enthusiasm of the stampede to the enlistment centres in 1939. There was a reality check, if you like, as a result of the memorials that had sprung up on every street corner, every town, every community in Australia. Nevertheless, the Second World War was certainly a conflict that Australia saw a role in, and for some early enlistment, it was an escape from the still lingering effects of the Great Depression. Indeed, by the end of the war, 997,000 Australians had worn a uniform out of a population of around 7 million. You know, we really truly were a nation at war.
And I was going to say arguably, but I think it's incontestable, that there were grounds for more unity of purpose and for more public support than there had been in World War I.
The Allied forces in the Second World War were fighting genuine evils in the world. There's very little difficulty in justifying objection to Nazism. And, of course, by 1942, the war had actually come to Australia. And so these are really strong motivations. The large numbers of Australians who signed up to serve in the Second World War have long enjoyed popular support.
Now, how does that support translate to the Cold War that followed hard on World War II?
Look, in the Cold War, much of that anti-Nazi rhetoric was easily transferable to communism. Australia in the 1950s was a rich ground for the perpetuation of the Anzac legend because of the creation of that image of a potential invader, a looming evil in the world. And so it was pretty straightforward to apply this idea of sacrifice for the greater good.
So on one hand, that plots a path towards unity of purpose, the country continuing to marshal its forces against a perceived common enemy. Regardless of what one thinks of the Cold War conflict, it certainly gave that unity of purpose. But in exactly the same period, I know that attitudes to the Anzac tradition and to Australia's military traditions also evolved along a different path. For example, and I'm going back to some personal experience again, at high school in the 1970s, we studied Alan Seymour's The One Day of the Year. The One Day of the Year, which premiered in 1960, depicted a family fracturing as the post-war generation began criticising Anzac Day commemorations. The play was enormously controversial. Alan Seymour even received death threats after he wrote it, and those criticisms of the Anzac tradition only increased in the 1980s. Much of the hostility among younger Australians in the 1960s and 70s was then influenced by Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, which added another complicating layer. Would it be accurate to say that the Vietnam War in particular tainted the legend and the kind of cultural mythos of Gallipoli and Anzac? And if so, in what ways did it do that?
You're right that the involvement in the war in Vietnam was enormously controversial, and of course it's happening at a time of social revolution. So the conservative 50s, by the 1960s, people are prepared to protest against the war in Vietnam, against conscription, against discrimination, against pollution. It was a time of generational change, and so those that knew the Second World War intimately were being replaced by or in conflict with a population that wanted to see change, and so they were choosing targets. And I think the Anzac legend was one of those old values that was clearly going to be the subject of criticism.
How significant is it that the Vietnam conflict was fought to further Cold War and more narrowly American interests?
The legacy of Vietnam and of American covert operations in Central and South America had long-term effects on how the general public perceived soldiers in particular and military history in general.
I've arrived at the point where I'm getting uncomfortably conscious of how many questions I'm able to ask on the basis of personal memory, Brad. Not that either of us is getting old, of course, but I can remember another distinct change in the atmosphere of the 1990s. The 1990s felt different in the context you're elaborating here. I wonder if you feel the same thing.
There was a seismic change in the 1990s. Since Vietnam and indeed the fall of Saigon in 1975, Australia had been reluctant to send troops overseas, and so the 1980s was a period of great peace, and then suddenly the 1990s happened. The first Gulf War saw the Royal Australian Navy's biggest deployment of conflict in over 20 years, and Australian military personnel played a major role as peacekeepers in war-torn Cambodia and genocide-ravaged Rwanda. By the end of the decade, Australian troops were stepping ashore in East Timor. So, the military was back in favour. However, there was a residual anti-war sentiment in relation to Australia's involvement in US military adventures in the Middle East. And I guess that was one of the sort of reminders, I suppose, dating back to the war in South Vietnam.
You mentioned a strain of pro-militarism. I'm interested because there are various different things going on at this time. So anti-war sentiment, as you say, but a streak of pro-militarism as well. Can you expand a little on that?
As pressure grew on the Conservative Australian government to support US military adventurism, and I'll use the term unashamedly, particularly in the Gulf, and a pro-war attitude fed by a range of heroic movies, military history suddenly became popular all over again. It's also possible that images of Australian military personnel enforcing peace and bringing humanitarian aid to trouble spots in Asia and Africa did much to elevate the esteem of the military in the eyes of the Australian public. Our people did a very credible job in Timor, helping to create the new nation, and they did it in the context of avoiding conflict with Indonesia. You know, they were really effective peacekeepers, and all of that effort is likely to have had an effect that enhanced the image of the military at that time.
This is the kind of situation that Conservative governments welcome. How does Australian government feed into the repopularisation of military history in this period? Now, in asking that, I'm conscious that Labor was in office from 1983 till 1996, also that Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister through much of that time, was an enthusiastic participant in the US's Middle Eastern involvement. Is that a perspective that's worth thinking about here?
I think the use of history as a political tool has become much more pronounced in recent years. Now, that may be the result of greater access to an all-pervasive media. I don't think that political persuasion of the government in power at the time makes as much difference as we might suspect. We had a Labor Prime Minister kissing the ground in New Guinea at Isharava, one of the 1942 battlefields on the Kokoda Trail. And then in 2001, barely a decade later, a Conservative Prime Minister commits Australian troops to a war in Afghanistan and yet another war in the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, unashamedly referencing our alliance with the Americans during the Second World War.
In this second part of our discussion of Anzac, Brad and I have talked about the often ignored but enduring presence of women in war, as well as in the years between and since the wars in which Australia has been involved. We have discussed also how the Anzac legend continued to evolve throughout the 20th century, during and after World War II and the Vietnam War, as well as the more recent role played by Australia in regional peacekeeping. Throughout this entire time, Australians have attempted to commemorate the events at Gallipoli by travelling to the site of battle. That tradition of pilgrimage is the subject of the final part of my conversation with Brad in episode 3. We acknowledge the elders past and present of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional owners of the lands on which this episode of Making Sense of History was recorded. The podcast was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities.